Hello everybody, we've got a quick homework video on the divisions of the nervous system. Really, it's spread up into two different divisions. So we've already talked about the neurons and talking about the action potential and synapses, how they work. So we're kind of getting into more of the structure of the nervous system. And then we're going to focus a lot on the brain. So there's two major divisions. And within those divisions, there are other divisions, so it can get a little complicated. The first one, though, central nervous system, is pretty simple. It's only the brain and spinal cord. Simple enough. Brain's obviously the control center of the entire nervous system. Every neuron eventually finds its way to the brain. And if you remember what I said, neurons primarily go in one direction. So these neurons are either going to the brain, or their signals are going at least pointed or flowing in the direction of the brain, or they're flowing away from the brain. And all of those signals, with the exceptions of the cranial nerves, which are the nerves that bypass the spinal cord because they're going to the different areas of the cranium or the skull, and different areas of the face. And there's also a nerve called the vagus nerve, which bypasses the spinal cord and travels down part of your neck and innervates many of your major organs, which is why you can have spinal cord damages at certain places and still be able to have somewhat functioning organs, although the muscular portion of those signals may be damaged because they flow through the spinal cord. So we'll have to get into a little bit more about that later on. But just know the vast majority of those neurons have to go through the spinal cord if they're a motor neuron or a sensory neuron. There's a couple exceptions to that, but for the most part, they travel through that spinal cord. So your brain's about 3 pounds, contains well over, sometimes well under, depending where you look, 100 billion neurons. Sometimes I see 86 billion, sometimes I see more. So they're still figuring out what that number is. But 100 billion is a nice round number. And if you can imagine that these neurons have hundreds and hundreds of connections between other neurons, do the math. And the complexity of the connections between these different neurons is amazing. So it's the most complicated computer that we've ever seen in the entire universe, or known universe. Doesn't even come close. Nothing that people have made has come close to the complexity of those connections within the brain. And the brain runs basically on 20 watts of electricity, which is like, a few nightlights. It can do all this stuff. So it's incredibly efficient. It's had, a few billion years to evolve. So it's had lots of trial and error to get to this point. So it's a pretty amazing little thing. So we'll spend some time talking about the brain later on. All right. Not much else to say about spinal cord. Spinal cord's kind of boring to me. We will say a little bit more about that a little bit later on. We get into more on the brain. So you can see the spinal cord. If you remember, it travels through a little hole in the cranium. It goes all the way down inside of all the vertebrae. And you can see it kind of ends at the kidney level. Basically right about here is where your kidneys are. One over there and one over there. The nerves coming off it, though, which are called the peripheral nerves, keep going down. But basically it ends right about there. And you can see the pelvis right there and then the tailbone. So that's kind of interesting that the spinal cord doesn't go all the way down the length of the vertebrae. But like I said, some of the nerves coming off it do travel all the way down. Love The Simpsons? So this poses a question: does the size of the brain matter in terms of what it can do? And research suggests that no, it doesn't. However, there's other research that suggests more neurons means it can do more. So it's all about context. I think in context of humans, having a brain that's a little bit bigger than someone else's, they haven't found any difference between how well it works. However, if you're comparing humans to other animals, there is. So the differences between different people and different genders, the different sizes of their brains, so far as what they can tell and what it can do is negligible or means nothing. But from animal to animal, species to species, there can be big differences. And obviously the more neurons you can pack in compared to another animal means you could potentially do more with that brain. So that makes sense. We know that males are a little bit bigger than females because of testosterone. Makes bones a little bit thicker, muscles thicker, have more muscle, etc., etc. So they have larger bodies in general, which generally means they have a little bit larger brain weight. Like I said, no difference in between functionality. Phrenology. This is a pseudoscience from the past. This is kind of an interesting little anecdote that I put in here, because when you're talking about, the brain and central nervous system, sometimes you get into what parts of the brain do what. And back in the day, they didn't really know, what parts of the brain did what. Somebody came up with this way of measuring the skull and measuring the different parts and different areas. And if you had a large area, like for number 11 right here, which means you were very cautious. So they tried to take different parts of the skull and measure it and kind of make sense out of it. And this is one of those things in science that for a little while people believed it, even though there wasn't any evidence for it, because some smart guy started talking about it, and I don't know how smart this guy really was. He thought he was on to something, but it's definitely pseudoscience. What we do know for sure is that different parts of the brain, inside the brain at least, deal with different functionality. Like I said, we'll spend some more time on this, but it's helpful to point this out when we start talking about the central nervous system, because the different neurons that are coming out of the brain, going down the spinal cord, have different functions and go to different places. So the origin of those neurons coming out of the spinal cord will have a unique spot in the brain. And you can see here there's different areas of vision, like in the back of the head. Cerebellum deals with balance, coordination. You got an area called Broca's area, which deals with language interpretation. And there's other parts of the brain that are deep inside here that you can't see, but you get the general idea. And the way they figure this out is when people have brain injuries, say somebody, has like a lobotomy or something like that, they lose the ability to see into the future. They lose their short-term memory. They have definite behavioral changes. They can't plan anymore. They may not be able to talk. They may not be able to smell if they have something damaged in this area. Somebody has a stroke in the back of the head, they may lose their sense of vision. So we primarily know what different areas of the brain do when there are problems, when there's damage. So now, we can also stimulate certain areas of the brain with electrodes to make things happen. You can stimulate the vision part of the brain, make people see things. So anyway, we have a very good body of scientific evidence in knowing what different parts of the brain do. So we're pretty good at that. We kind of know that for the most part. How the brain, communicates with this side to that side and does all this stuff. That's the part that's a little bit still misunderstood. In addition to memory, it's still trying to figure out how the brain makes memories. It's pretty amazing. Anyways, don't want to get too drawn up into that just yet. So the central nervous system is pretty simple. Brain and spinal cord. There's no other divisions. Simple stuff. The peripheral nervous system has a lot more divisions and requires a little bit more energy for us to learn. Peripheral means off to the side. So it really means off to the side of the spinal cord. It's pretty easy to define. It's all neurons not in the brain and spinal cord. Pretty simple. So there are two major divisions within the peripheral nervous system. You have the sensory division and motor division. Sensory division is pretty easy because it doesn't have any other divisions. These are basically any sensory neurons that are taking information from the outside world, like a sense of sight and touch and hearing, and sending it back to the brain. There's also sensory data that can come from the internal world, like if the brain is trying to figure out what temperature is around the body. So you get temperature receptors in different parts of the body that send information to the brain about body temperature. So it's not just outside the body, but any information that the brain needs to make some decisions about what to do with some of its internal mechanisms. All of these sensory division neurons are going to the brain. Nothing in the sensory division is going away from the brain. All this information is traveling to the brain. Motor division is quite the opposite. All this information is traveling away from the brain. And it's in response to a lot of different things. It's in response to sensory division information. It's in response to memory. It's in response to your own thoughts. It's in response to what you're seeing, plus memory, plus some of your decision-making skills, all this stuff put together. Sometimes you have control over it, sometimes you don't. But regardless, the motor division is a response. So those neurons are facing away from the brain, so to speak, and they're sending their signals away from the brain. And since it's a motor division, it is primarily controlling neurons that have to do with movement. There are some that can go to glands. There are some that can go to also adipose tissue, which is fat tissue, because there'll be a portion of that tissue that can make a particular hormone. So fat tissue does make some hormones. But by and large, these are mostly for neurons with muscles. Now within the motor division, we have a couple of divisions. The first one is called somatic division. So this is all voluntary muscle movements. This would basically be the skeletal muscles. All right, soma means body, so it's like means moving the body. So that really means like referring to the skeletons, I guess, when they originally named that one. And from there we have the autonomic division. There's a lot going on with the autonomic division. Autonomic kind of sounds like automatic. So this is all the involuntary muscle movements. All right. So they are involuntary in the autonomic division. And there's a couple different groups. And when you hear the words sympathetic and parasympathetic, it has nothing to do with the word sympathy. All right, so it's a total, they named this a long time ago, and it has nothing to do with what you would think of as being sympathy. But that's when most people hear this for the first time. That's what they think of. Anyways, so the sympathetic system, really you should be thinking of, if we're talking about the peripheral nervous system, is the fight or flight system. This is the excitatory portion of the nervous system. It increases metabolism, for example, increases alertness, prepares the body for emergencies. That's primarily what we should be thinking about. But the sympathetic nervous system is basically always activated. It's not always activated to the level where you see a lot of this stuff happening, like emergencies or alertness, metabolism. But just to stay alive, just to get out of bed in the morning, just to have that motivation and make your body work towards that motivation, the sympathetic nervous system has to be activated. So these are always working together, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. All right? And para means basically the opposite. It's referred to as the rest and digest system. So it's used to conserve energy, promote sedentary activities, things like digestion and tissue repair. It's when you're resting, more or less. So these are always working together. So it isn't just when you are in a fight or flight situation. It isn't just when you're laying down and digesting. It's when something is needed in the body or needs stimulation. The sympathetic nervous system will be activated. Parasympathetic will be activated when stimulation needs to be turned off. For example, like something as simple as your heart rate. So your heart's a muscle, so your heart is, partially controlled by this. So sympathetic nervous system, is involved with increasing your heart rate. Simple enough. Parasympathetic is involved with decreasing it. All right, so that's kind of what's going on with that. When either one of these is turned on to the extreme, that's where you kind of get what they're named after, the fight or flight system. So remember, these are involuntary. So this would be like if you're, walking down the street at night in the city by yourself and you see like 3 people jump out at you. And one of them potentially got a gun or a knife and they want to rob you, beat you up, do something. That's when the sympathetic nervous system is going to get switched on and all the responses that go with it. When you're sleeping at night, your parasympathetic system is switched on. It's kind of counterintuitive. But so to speak, the sympathetic nervous system is shut down and the parasympathetic system is turned on when you are sleeping at night. If you are, in a fight or flight situation, you're definitely not going to feel like sleeping. All right? So they are opposites of each other and they work independently, but at the same time, they do work together to accomplish the goals of the body. So I'll show you a chart about what's going on with some of those in just a minute. So this picture is showing you the peripheral nervous system. You can see showing you the central nervous system too. You got the brain and spinal cord here, but the peripheral nervous system is all the nerves coming off of that spinal cord. So they're very thick nerves, and as they leave the spinal cord, they'll eventually get smaller and smaller, and they'll branch off, and they go to different parts of the body, and they innervate those different parts of the body. Okay, so lastly, here's a chart looking at some of the different effects, the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. You get sympathetic over here, you get parasympathetic over here. You can see the word stimulate sometimes in the parasympathetic, so it can be, counterintuitive. All right. Sometimes when something is a muscle constricted, it is taking away something like light here. All right. So, and it's not a direct, I don't know what to say, like correlation between rest. But for the most part, you'll see in general, a lot of these functionalities are on here that has something to do with rest or decreasing or like letting less light in, which is what constriction is. Because dilating pupils is a sympathetic effect. Neither one of these has anything to do with, with the iris of the eye has anything to do with fight or flight or anything like that directly. But there is a relationship between the two because one dilates the pupils of the eye and one constricts them. So this is the nature of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. They have a yin and yang, left and right type of relationship. And then there's even a lot of things like sweat glands are not even innervated by the parasympathetic. So a lot of different things going on here. We have constrict bronchioles, dilate bronchioles. Contract smooth muscle of the bladder wall, relaxes smooth muscle of the bladder wall. So again, this seems counterintuitive, and sometimes they are. But peeing has some sort of relationship to digestion and removal of that. So, it does, the descriptions we had earlier do pretty much work. So when you look through here, take a few minutes and look at it, you can see that there is a relationship between the two. Just don't look at the individual words themselves. And if that chart doesn't do much for you, you can take a look at this picture and you can see in different form the contrasting functionality between sympathetic and parasympathetic. So over here you got the sympathetic on this side now. Parasympathetic is over here. So when your sympathetic nervous system is stimulated, you're not going to have a lot of digestion going on. You're not going to pee. So your bronchial tubes are going to be dilated, not constricted. Your pupils may be dilated, not constricted. All right, so that's kind of a relationship between the two. But they're all dealing with involuntary muscular neurons. So one of the questions that'll come up and I'll ask you, it says, like, for example, what parts of the CNS and PNS are used to throw a softball? So you might be tempted to just kind of simplify this, but we really got to get down to details. Somebody might say, well, we use the brain and to kind of like coordinate the muscles, and then we throw the softball by using the part of our nervous system that deals with voluntary muscles. And you may be tempted to leave it at that. The best answer for this would be much more complicated than that. Neurons of the sensory division send visual information from the eye to the, I'm also supposed to say brain there. Because even before anything happens, you have to know where you're going to throw the softball to, so you have to see your target. The brain fires motor neurons in the perfect practice sequence down the spinal cord into neurons in the motor division to coordinate muscle contractions that enable the player to hit the identified target. So once you got your target, the decision is going to be made, and this is going to be a voluntary decision. All right. So which parts of the motor division would you be using for that voluntary division? All right. If it's voluntary, you'd be using the somatic nervous system. Brain and spinal cord are part of the CNS, so you would have to mention that. And you would say the motor and sensory divisions are part of the peripheral nervous system. All right. And then obviously you might want to add in there, like I said before, about the somatic nervous system being used because you're using skeletal muscles to voluntarily move your skeleton. So when you get questions like this, you got to be pretty detailed, and you got to think of all the potential divisions that are being used. All right, that's it. Thanks.